As the coronavirus sends the nation's unemployment rate soaring, young Americans are being disproportionately impacted. Pew Research says that there are about 19 million Americans aged 16 to 24 in the labor force. More than 9 million of them are in the service sector. But according to the Labor Department, that industry lost 47% of jobs in April alone. As Charlotte Alter writes for Time, few groups will be more impacted by COVID-19 than the class of 2020. She spoke to recent college graduates about how the pandemic will shape the rest of their lives. And Charlotte Alter joins me now. She's a national correspondent for Time. She's also the author of The Ones We've Been Waiting For: How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. Charlotte, thank you for joining us. By the way, I love the title of that book. I'm just curious, Charlotte, how are the graduates that you spoke to, how are the graduates that you spoke to trying to get by as they prepare to leave that safety net of college?
So they're not doing so great. This is always a stressful time to graduate from college. This is always a moment that carries a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress. But this is a particularly terrible moment for these graduates because there's really a lot of questions about what's happening next for them, and there just are not jobs available for this cohort in the way there once were.
You know, it's not also just about jobs, it's about livelihood and health. When you look back at past recessions, how have graduates of those classes been impacted?
So there's a lot of research around this. I mean, typically graduating into a recession can affect your earnings for up to a decade afterwards because you're starting off behind other young people who are graduating into better economic conditions. And that's also correlated with health and happiness. I mean, graduates who graduated into the recession in the early 1980s had higher divorce rates, higher mortality, higher risk of heart disease, and were less likely to be living with their children than young people who graduated even just a few months earlier or after they did.
That is so incredible to hear that there's a correlation. Understood. It's so fascinating to hear that there's that correlation. When you look at the Generation Z, particularly, what do you think will be further compounded that they'll be dealing with when it comes to COVID-19?
Well, this is a generation, you have to remember, they already had a lot of skepticism about our government and our political system and the way our economy was working. Much of the Bernie Sanders momentum that we saw in the Democratic primary this year was motivated by some of the anxieties of this cohort. So coming into this crisis, this generation was already extremely disillusioned with the American government's ability to solve big problems. Remember, these are the kids who grew up experiencing school shootings happening every other week, hearing about another school being shot up, experiencing terrifying threat of existentially blowing up climate change, things that really seem to be impacting how these kids were viewing the world. Climate change is something that they're really, really concerned about. So already these young people felt that the government was not taking their concerns seriously and was not capable of solving big problems. And that's why this is a moment that will really either restore their faith in the American government or reinforce their doubts and contribute to a deeper disillusionment.
You know, it's no secret, as you mentioned, the Bernie Sanders generation, a lot of these young people skew towards the left. But you also write about how the pandemic has changed the outlook for young Republicans. How has COVID-19 affected the political outlook of the class of 2020?
So I think it's a little bit too early to tell. I mean, as I wrote a lot in my book about millennials and how some of the major events of their lives impacted their politics. But typically it takes at least a couple months or a year or preferably 5 years to really see how this kind of thing can impact them. I do think that early reports show that they are not feeling good about the way that the government is responding to this. Less than 1 in 10 say that the government is working as it should be. Less than 1 in 5 consider themselves very patriotic. They overwhelmingly disapprove of Donald Trump. And 7 in 10 young Americans say that they want the government to do more to solve big problems, and that includes more than half of young Republicans. So it's really important to understand when thinking about this cohort, they're deeply disillusioned with institutions, they're deeply disillusioned with the government, but it's not because they think the government is doing too much, it's because they think the government isn't doing enough.
Mm. Well, the book is called The Ones We've Been Waiting For. I want to thank you very much, Charlotte Alter, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.